Thank you all for coming. Let's get started tonight. Welcome to this event by the Hamilton School for Classical and Civic Education. I'm Robert Ingram, the interim director of the Hamilton School. Molly Worthen has come to us tonight from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she is a professor of history, a newly minted professor of history. Congratulations. She did her BA and PhD at Yale University. In addition to being a first-rate scholar, she's a freelance journalist who has written regularly for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and elsewhere. So her scholarly research focuses on North American religious and intellectual history. Her first book is about a figure some of you may know, Charles Hill, a legendary Yale professor and former diplomat who was himself the author of the influential book, Grand Strategies. Hill, along with John Gaddis and Paul Kennedy, created Yale's famous programming Grand Strategy, which is itself the inspiration for the Hamilton School's new major, War, Statecraft, and Strategy. Worthen's undergraduate seminar paper on Hill blossomed into an eventually very fine biography called The Man on Whom Nothing Was Lost. From Hill, she turned to something totally different, American evangelical intellectual life after World War II. In Apostles of Reason, which came out in 2013, she tried to get at the complicated essence of American evangelicalism, and particularly the ways that evangelicals reconciled faith and reason, how they thought about Jesus, and how they conceived of their public role after Christendom's rupture. She's with us today to have a conversation with my colleagues Jeff Collins and Paul Lim about her most recent book, Spellbound. Pitched as a history of charisma as both a political and religious concept from John Winthrop to Donald Trump, Spellbound asks what happens when religious faith is lost and people turn to politics instead. For on her reading, that thing we call secularization is really just a story of traditional institutions losing influence over individuals, and not, as many would have it, the collapse of Westerners' spiritual needs. The world we inhabit today is the product of the world we've lost, and charisma is one way to help us make sense of it. So Spellbound is, I think it's fair to say, a timely book. And we're grateful Molly has taken the time to come here to UF to discuss it, and I hope you'll join with me in welcoming her here to UF and to the Hamilton School.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank all of you for coming to this event. We'll just lay out the agenda here. Paul and I are going to do this in interview style, and Molly's going to explain her book, its argument, its genesis, and so forth. We'll save a bit of time for questions at the end, so be formulating questions as the event proceeds. Understanding you probably haven't read the book yet, but before I get to the questions, I'm going to urge you to read the book. I have read the book cover to cover. Often when you do these things, you sort of read the book to get the questions for the interview, but this is one I actually read cover to cover because I found it so fascinating. It's beautifully written, it's full of insight, it's very accessible, but it's got some profound kind of points to make. And I think you'll find it's also full of very strange stories. It's a sort of subterranean history, really, of American political and religious life from founding through Donald Trump, as the book says. So, with that as a pitch and introduction, I'm going to ask Molly to begin our conversation by just telling us how you came up with this book, what the arguments are, kind of present the basic ligaments of the book to the room.
I'm wearing one. Thank you guys for coming to this. I mean, it's 5 o'clock on a Monday and people are busy, and I just really, really appreciate it. It's really fun to get to talk about this project with you. The genesis of this book was a while ago because historians take a long time to write books. So about 10 years ago, I guess there was the confluence of some questions I've been pondering for a long time with the immediate political landscape. So 2015, 2016, I think like a lot of people, I was puzzling over the deeply polarized reactions provoked by Donald Trump and trying to think through how is it that this one individual and one set of speeches and stories about him and social media posts provokes, in one swath of the country, total excitement and desire to be part of this movement. And then in another huge swath of the country, absolute revulsion. Like, what's going on? What's the dynamic? And then that, I guess, was hitting me against the backdrop of a broader problem that I had been thinking about for a while that faces those of us in academia and in journalism who pay attention to religion. And that is that over the past few generations, we have relied a lot on statistics, statements by the official heads of religious institutions to serve as a kind of shorthand for what's happening with religion in America. What is the rate of church attendance? When pollsters call people up, like how many say that they believe the Bible is true or pray, this sort of thing. And we know that over the past couple of generations, those numbers have been generally trending. They haven't been dropping like that, but they've been generally trending down, although there have been some interesting exceptions lately, especially among Gen Z, so we can talk about that if you're interested later. But we know that that's sort of the general trend line. But I guess I have always thought, since, being an undergraduate, taking classes in history and literature and philosophy, that humans are, in this fundamental way, religious creatures, that we are just wired to seek a connection between our own puny story of suffering and chaos and some big transcendent narrative. I think we're wired to worship. We're wired to elevate something above and beyond us to which we are directed. And it seemed to me a mistake to think that just because that impulse is not landing as often as it once did in churches and temples and so forth, that it is just evaporating, that probably it's landing somewhere else. And I had a working hypothesis that maybe one place it's landing is in the relationship between certain leaders and followers. So I wanted to investigate charisma. But partly I'll add because I wasn't even quite sure what charisma is. So we could talk about that, the problem of definition too, if you want.
Excellent. Paul.
Sure. Well, let's start with that, then how you use that term, charisma, charismata. So there's definitely a religious kind of undertone and overtone to it, and you use that a lot. You begin the book by talking about Anne Hutchinson's kind of banishment and that sort of prophetic figures. And so I was really interested in how you have started with that kind of religious narrative in the Protestant Reformation and the aftermath in New England. So can you tell us a little bit more about how prophet, and then it goes beyond that to the 5 typology, which I thought was really fascinating, conqueror and agitator and experts and guru. So can you maybe tell us about the prophet, and then we'll see how it goes. How about that?
So these are types of charismatic leaders that I argue kind of rise in cultural influence and then taper off. But I guess I should back up and tell you a little bit about how I came to think about charisma. The book's about 2 kinds of charisma, sort of the intertwined story of charisma in the sense that it appears in the New Testament. It comes originally from the ancient Greek word charis, meaning divine anointing, chosenness by the gods. In that ancient Greek context, it could mean a gift that redounds to the benefit of the recipient, or something that really has some negative consequences. And then in the New Testament, Paul takes it and adds the ma, the suffix, and it means slightly different things in different contexts. In his letter to the Romans, it means the free gift of grace to all Christians. In his first letter to the Corinthians, he's talking about specific spiritual gifts, prophecy, healing, tongues, this kind of thing. So an unbidden supernatural gift, right? So I'm interested in that, number one. But then charisma in the colloquial sense, right? That we use it now when we talk about leaders in politics or other spheres. And I was intrigued by the way in which it seems like we kind of punt to this word charisma when we don't really know what's going on. Like we're watching something unfold between a leader and followers, and we're sort of scratching our heads. Like we don't really see what the followers are getting out of this. Like, don't they see through this person? What is it? What is this? And then I think we also use it in other contexts, like more interpersonally. You're at a party and you're really struck by someone you have a conversation with, and you might call that person charismatic. When I started this project, I confused charisma with charm. I thought I would be writing a book about loads of charming people, like people really good at working a room. Probably they'd mostly be super good looking, and they'd be amazing public speakers. Like that was my vision. And that showed up kind of here and there in the cast of characters I ended up assembling. But for the most part, that's not like the big headline for the people I found myself writing about. In fact, the common denominator was that charismatic figures provoke a polarizing reaction. There's a lot of people who are really enthralled by the person and people who loathe the person, and not a lot of lukewarm reaction. The definition I ended up settling on is that charisma, in this political sense, charisma is a particular kind of storytelling. It's a relationship between a leader and followers premised on the leader inviting followers into a story to take up a role in a transcendent narrative that offers a more satisfying sense of meaning and what the point of my life is, like what the arc is and how I fit in, than the other stories on offer in the culture. And that the charisma, actually, the person's important, the leader's important, but it really resides in the story. And it can travel. It can travel via media, and you don't have to have a personal encounter. But your reaction to the leader, as a person, it depends on the role that he or she is offering you in the story that they're telling. And so this was the definition that emerged as I just sort of plowed into American history from the 1600s to the present, just trying to settle on religious and political movements that seem to tell me something interesting about the anxieties and desires and fears of that era. And it's the power of the charismatic leader to tell a story that speaks to those fears and desires in some fresh way that I think is the heart of it. And this is a story also about the relationship between these leaders and the stories they tell and institutions. There's always this sort of dialectic between charismatic leaders and institutions. So in the first section of the book, which I call the prophets, this is these are colonists, who are coming out of a European context in which they are still pretty close, kind of culturally, intellectually, in a lot of important ways, to the institutions and traditions of the old world. And so the charismatic figures who emerge to kind of challenge this, they are tethered, I think, in a pretty still a pretty powerful way to the very traditions that they critique. They really function like the prophets do in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, Isaiah, Ezekiel, these guys would make no sense outside of the context of the divine history of Israel and this plan and a certain frame of cultural reference that readers have. And I think that's true of this era of the prophets. And yet there's a sense the reason this woman, Anne Hutchinson, I mean, she's a midwife, sort of part-time, and really a sort of self-taught Bible scholar who becomes increasingly concerned that the ministers in the colony are not preaching what she considers the most biblical message. She's worried that they're telling the people of Massachusetts Bay Colony that there's some way in which you can earn your salvation. And she wants to say, no, if you are among God's elect, I mean, as you read the Bible and pray, the Holy Spirit will tell you directly. You will have this kind of personal experience that is unimpeachable. And I think in the context of this highly unstable, scary, colonial Massachusetts, especially when you remember that this woman is a midwife. She's also going through her own, sort of lifelong cycles of pregnancies and miscarriages and all kinds of suffering. She is a theologian in the trenches. She is there with these families at 3 a.m. on a January night with snow drifts up to here, when they've just lost a baby and maybe the mother is on the verge of death too. And I just imagine her grappling with like the failure of last Sunday's sermon to really give comfort to this grieving family, and the way that might inform her sense that no, you can reach out for a message directly from the Holy Spirit. But this is deeply disturbing to those representatives of kind of the institutional church who she is challenging. But we see a sort of pendulum swing across American history, that there are periods when I think there's been this real appetite for tearing down, challenging institutions. And then that's followed in kind of the narrative I found myself piecing together by more of an appetite for building and constructing.
That's great. So maybe then we can move to the second part, which is conquerors. I found that really interesting, because I think I'm assuming most of us haven't read the book. So maybe you can kind of go through each of those steps and what you saw in them that was really kind of peculiar and particular to your overall intention as an author. And what were some of the biggest surprises for you as you did the research? Because I'll tell you what was most surprising to me as I read your book, but I'll let you tell your story first.
Part of the fun of this project was I thought, okay, I'm writing a book about charismatic leaders. I have to include, some of the usual suspects, like, people you would expect to find in a book about charismatic leaders. So, okay, John F. Kennedy, I had to come up with some way, way to work him in. In this earlier period, I thought, okay, I need to write about George Washington. But then I also I was interested in sort of the weird stories too, the less expected angles, especially because this is just the only thing you can control when you're writing a book, right? Is what you learn in the process of doing it. You can't control really if it's any good or if anyone likes it, but you can control what you learn. And I was really excited to just spend time with some of the more the kind of encounters with the supernatural that are a little bit, from our sort of secular position here in 2025, a little bit less familiar. So the era of the conquerors kind of follows the colonial period. And George Washington gave me a way to sort of wrap up the colonial period and transition into this, because he was in many ways, I think, the anti-prophet. He is a great example of this broader pattern I noticed in leaders who emerged as most successful. If we measure success by their ability to, get their sort of policy ideas actually instantiated in the reality of the country or the community they're working in. I think he saw and understood the chaos of the Revolutionary era, which, of course, we know about the sort of military upheaval, but also it's a time when there's a number of kind of upstart religious movements and self-declared prophets running around saying, come join me in my utopian experiment. And while there's an appeal in those movements, they speak to a sort of, a deeper desire for stability. And I think that's really at the core of Washington's political genius, his ability to telegraph that message that, we've just come through this gauntlet of the war, and now this is going to be an era of stability and building. And that continues in some ways in the kind of vision presented by maybe some of the obvious conquerors, right? So I was drawn to the story of Andrew Jackson and his quite literal sort of mission of conquest and moving, displacing indigenous people, and parlaying his track record as this sort of mythologized war hero into a story of what was possible if the American people, right? There's this sort of populist quality to his appeal. Are trusted to elect this leader who will push across the continent. And this is leading into the era that we associate with manifest destiny and this sense of divine right that European Americans have to the continent. But I was also interested in spiritual conquerors. So I wrote about Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who I think sensed a hunger and a frustration that working class, kind of poor, struggling farmers in New England had with the existing theological framework of traditional Christianity. And he sensed a desire for kind of the offer of a new religious role that this new country would play. And so his revelation, what he introduces to the world as the Book of Mormon, that he says he has translated from these golden plates revealed to him by the angel Moroni, is this sort of second act to the New Testament that relocates the center of Christian salvific history in the New World. And this is something that's sort of forgotten now when we talk about Mormon history, but in those first editions of the Book of Mormon, the subtitle was very specific. It was a message to the Lamanites being the ancestor people in Joseph Smith's telling to modern indigenous Americans. So this was actually a specific message to indigenous Americans that they had this heritage that they had no recollection of. And so it is the first Mormons had this vision of both creating a sort of political kingdom, but also evangelizing and assimilating and bringing into their status as chosen people American Indians. The first Mormons spoke in tongues all the time. Mormons today do not do this. It was banned by the church, quite a while ago. But these first Mormons had these supernatural experiences that they believed was the Holy Spirit equipping them for communication with indigenous Americans. So that's how they understood these unintelligible speech sounds that they were producing. Right? That's maybe one definition for speaking in tongues. So I was interested in the way in which there's a divine manifest destiny. And I got sort of carried along another trajectory in my investigations of women spiritualist trance speakers. So this is 1840s, 1850s. This is a period when it was unacceptable for a single woman to even take the train alone. And at this time, there were a couple of hundred young women who made their living as trance speakers, meaning they would fill an auditorium of thousands of people, and they would walk in supposedly in the state of trance, making their body available as a medium to a ghost in the spirit world. Sometimes that spirit would be a famous figure like Benjamin Franklin, sometimes not. And the way these events would often work is that the organizer would assemble a kind of ad hoc committee from random men in the audience. And those men would confer, and they would come up with some questions to ask this. The most famous trance speaker was this young woman, Cora Scott, who, at the height of her career, she was 16 years old. So this 16-year-old blonde girl with beautiful ringlets standing there like this. I got the Spirit's command. She's waiting for this committee of men to come up with these questions. And they would try to come up with questions that seemed totally beyond the purview of a teenage girl, right? Like something that she couldn't possibly answer. So maybe an elaborate theological question about the Trinity. Explain how a gyroscope works, like this sort of thing. And she would give, the conceit is that this is the Spirit talking through her. She would give a totally eloquent, some of these speeches she gave were transcribed, disquisition responding to these questions. And maybe some people would remain skeptical, but she would convince many. Now, how is she a conqueror? Well, the whole worldview of spiritualism is one of that says that death is not the end, and that humans, as they progress and become more enlightened and they master the ways of communicating with the spirit world, they can conquer death. And in fact, they can look forward to a kind of life of eternal progression. And so there's this way in which that is the story, that is the charismatic story that these teenage girls are inviting their audiences into. Spiritualism was this incredibly influential religious movement. It's hard to measure because very few people were sort of officially affiliated with, and there were spiritualist churches, but you can't like count heads with church membership in the way you could for other religious groups. But if you are gauging by, people who are reading this flourishing media world of spiritualist magazines, who are going to seances, who are interested in trying to communicate with loved ones, especially in the wake of the Civil War, right? We know that Mary Todd Lincoln dragged Abraham Lincoln to seances for this very purpose. So this is a really compelling story about meaning in the midst of suffering and chaos.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you. As a writer myself, one of the things that I really look for when I read a new book is what are some of the words and wordsmithing that are really kind of capturing my attention. The one that really grabbed my attention is something called metaphysical entrepreneurs. Remember that? It shows up very early. So you talked about these metaphysical entrepreneurs. That it seems that the spiritualists and Joseph Smith and others were using the mystery of the metaphysical insights that they had, but then there's a consequence of prophets bringing in prophets. P-R-O-P-H-E-T, bringing in P-R-F. You think about Joseph Smith and the kind of Roman Empire and the spiritual. So can you tell us a little bit, and that certainly adds to the charisma to me, if you are able to peer into the unknown and are able to speak intelligibly about it, and also people's lives are changed. They want to give to your kind of, whatever nonprofit, ministry, organization. And so then we come from the elect nation to the election of, as you take us all the way to the end of Donald Trump. So maybe tell us a little bit more about that, kind of how metaphysical entrepreneurship has kind of flourished in America in ways that perhaps other countries don't. But it seems to me, as I do religious history, it seems that America is a very unique kind of blend of capitalism and the gospel in a way that has really kind of not just about charismatic churches, right, as in like the Pentecostals, but it seems like that's become a sort of a woven fabric of American religiosity, if you please.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to be up here with two early modernists because I do think that prehistory, the context of the Reformation and the disproportionate number of American immigrants who come out of a very particular relationship to the Reformation. I think it's so important for understanding the religious and cultural landscape that makes possible a kind of spiritual or metaphysical entrepreneurship that flourishes in this country in a way that I think is really quite exceptional. Historians are always very careful about narratives of American exceptionalism, but I think this is one way in which it is useful to trace a particular narrative. So if you think about the Reformation, and like the famous faces of the Reformation, right? You think about Martin Luther and him, posting his 95 Theses on the church door, and having his internal struggles that resolve when he sees that, in fact, he cannot and need not earn salvation, but rather God's arbitrary grace simply changes his status and makes him one of the saved. Certainly, Martin Luther, for all of his criticisms of the Catholic Church, he was not some sort of anarcho-populist, right, who wanted the average peasant to just throw off all authority and go, run after the Holy Spirit. In fact, kind of infamously during the Peasants' War, when a bunch of peasants did take his theology as license to go to war against unfair landlords, he wrote a treatise called Against the Thieving, Murderous Hordes of Peasants, in which he was like, you guys have totally got me all wrong. And he really, tried to work with the institutions and, to sort of get his message out there. However, there is, like at the core of the Protestant Reformation, this this claim that the most central thing is your personal relationship with the divine, that there is a relationship between you and God, and it is an interior thing. There's something that happens between you, the individual, and your God, and your conscience is activated in this way. And in that seed, I think we find the kernel of a very powerful metaphysical kind of individualism that, while it's in tension with these other dimensions of the Protestant Reformation and what follows, it is, in a sense, the most important. It's like this flame that will not go out. And in the context of the New World, of the American colonies, it really catches fire, I think. And there's this way in which the kind of compromise, the political compromise that the founders work out regarding the relationship between religious institutions and the federal government, and then eventually with state governments, that is, I mean, creates the freest religious marketplace in the Western world. Far more so than the context in revolutionary France, certainly. It's not a totally free marketplace. It's still, for the kind of people with power in the country, they think of it as a Protestant country, I think, in many important ways. But it makes possible and, in fact, encourages a kind of competition for followers, for devotees, that really encourages entrepreneurship. And so I think there's a way in which that and a kind of deep-seated suspicion of centralized institutional power that is also rather special to America's history as a revolutionary state. I mean, in the context of our revolution, the United States lopped off a significant part of the Anglo-American political heritage, namely the sort of Tory, trust, centralized elite authority with power part of that heritage, which later in British and Canadian history gives you not just the Tory right, but also the social democratic left, like the traditions on right and left that trust concentration of power in elite institutions. That's missing from the post-revolutionary DNA of this country. And so that sort of abiding distrust of institutions and elites, which sort of ebbs and flows in American culture. There's periods where it's really burning hot and periods where it recedes. I think that, too, lends particular power to these charismatic figures in a way that is maybe more resonant than in other cultural contexts.
Yeah, sure, of course, yeah. Sure.
So, I mean, it's a fascinating argument, which really kind of puts together populist politics and sectarian religiosity of a kind of Pentecostal or charismatic type, traces it through sort of periods of crisis. It seems that's when this sort of ebbs most strongly, when people are looking for some sort of historical meaning and trying to find their place inside that historical meaning. And these figures, religious and political, provide this. And then, as you say, there's a kind of cycle back to sort of anti-charismatic figures to sort of stabilize things, and we come up to the next. But I'm kind of curious about the category itself. You mentioned this as a subject for discussion in your introductory remarks of charisma. And maybe you could tell the room when the term enters into our kind of political journalism, when it enters into sociological analysis of the United States, the sense that the United States is particularly prone to this kind of charismatic style of politics. Just because it functions in the book as an actor's category and an observer's category to some extent. At times people are talking quite explicitly about charisma, and then at other times you're using the category to describe people who would not have used it in quite the way you're using it. So maybe the terminology could be.
Yeah, absolutely. The word charisma is one of these rare cases where we actually can be quite precise about how it found its way into our conversation as we use it when we talk about politics and so forth. So for 1900 years, It was a term that you would know if you were a Bible nerd or a scholar of ancient Greek or Koine Greek. It had its meaning in the context of the New Testament, this theological meaning. But outside of circles of biblical study and church history, you would not hear the word. It would not have much meaning at all, if any. The German sociologist Max Weber, in the first decade of the 20th century, he had heard this word as a student listening to church historians lecture. He borrows the word from that context and kind of reinvents it. This is a time when the social sciences, as we know them today, are just beginning to get started, right? This is the early days of sociology, psychology in all its various forms. And there's a desire among Weber and his colleagues to be kind of respectable citizens of the modern research university as it's taking shape first in Germany, and then it finds its way over here. And so a real, a sort of allergy to any term that's too theological. So I think what Weber is doing here is he senses that there is this dynamic, there's this kind of authority that is different from authority you would get from your position in an institution, authority you would get because you have a big military at your command, or because you can claim tradition. There's this other kind of authority that has to do with a leader persuading followers that he or she has supernatural gifts or achievements, like something beyond the natural realm is going on here. And he's trying to give his squeamish secular colleagues vocabulary for this thing that won't fit in their rationalist, sort of materialist boxes. And so when he writes about charisma, he uses it in this kind of broader sense that can apply to political situations, or it can apply, he writes about Joseph Smith, it can apply to religion. So he's trying to make it kind of more versatile and useful. But he keeps using language like, the master and his disciples have to, they maintain this tie to, the world beyond, this kind of thing. And you can read him metaphorically if you like, but I read him as saying, there is this like X factor that we can't, we secular social scientists, we can't totally get rid of it. But that is the origin point. And then, the history from there is that, first people are just reading Weber in the German. He died young of the influenza epidemic. His wife and colleagues, sorted through the papers he left on his desk and published a lot of his writings about charisma after his death. They get translated, they find their way into English-speaking academic circles. From there, it sort of leaches into the world of journalism. And a really interesting moment is the context of World War II, in which observers of the rise of fascist leaders, especially Hitler, apply the word charisma to the phenomenon that they are seeing. And there is this way in which the word is capturing this confusing sort of civilization-wide irrationality. And what's so interesting to me, so the kind of the maybe most counterintuitive part of my story, where I'm writing about the most people where you like scratch your head and think, really? Is that person charismatic? Is the period of the book from about 1945 to 1965, which I call the era of the experts. Like, on the face of it, experts, as creatures of institutions who have authority because they've got credentials, they seem like they are the opposite of these charismatic leaders who are claiming divine revelation and all of this, right? Well, what happens is that in the wake of Hitler, scholars and journalists, sort of commentators of all kinds, essentially say, if that is what charisma is, it has no place in modern, free Western democracies. That is not where we are putting our trust. And there comes this, I think, very exceptional period in American history when Americans are willing to be persuaded by the story that experts are telling about progress, about John F. Kennedy's New Frontier, right? Trust the technocrats, trust the knowledge workers. They will get us to the moon. They will raise the standard of living. And it's so interesting, if you look at political science journals from this time, they're still writing about charisma, but they see it in the leaders of newly independent African countries. They see it in the global South, in contexts that are not as developed, that are in some sense not as modern as they conceive of their own civilization to be. And I think that's a blind spot. I think they are having this, they're failing to see the way in which absolutely there continues a sort of metaphysical hunger in their own civilization. But there is this sort of long shadow cast by World War II and by Hitler that both popularizes the word charisma but makes people uncomfortable with it in an interesting way.
There is an interesting bit here that I think we might want to talk about as well. On the one hand, there's Weber, but on the other hand, there is Azusa Street Revival that actually then brings up a cadre of Christians, and as you mentioned, Global South. Right now, the vast majority of Global South Christians are Pentecostals, right? And they use the word charismata. They don't use it, they live it, right? I mean, they are like, that's what that is about. So can we maybe talk about both religion and politics? On the one hand, there is this kind of use of Weberian sense and dis-ease with, Hitlerian kind of misuse. But then the Pentecostal Christians have always been, since the Azusa Street Revival, been somewhat kind of looked askance by the mainstream, whether it is mainline Protestants or Catholics or evangelicals, but they have sort of experienced a second naivete of gaining greater respectability and so on. So I do think that there may be something there to think about the religious movement of worldwide charismatic movement that has become a very interesting force in and of itself, and how that also kind of gives you a language and a typology to talk about how something that is mysterious and invisible, and yet it is something so palpably experienced by changed lives and so on. So whether we can, and then maybe that, and along with it, perhaps you can add a little bit about the sort of current phenomenon. I mean, like I'm, in my 50s, 20 years ago, we didn't talk about followers, right? But now, because of the advent of social media, some people measure their sense of worth by how many followers do you have. And I think that's very interesting Protestant phenomenon as well, because when I talk to my Jesuit priest friends, they always make fun of Protestant pastors, because they said when I talk to Protestant pastors, one of the first 5 questions that they ask of each other is, how many people do you have coming to your church? And that helps you size up the sense of, do I need to follow this guy or not? So I think you're right that there's something peculiar about Protestantism, because my Jesuit friends say, like, we Catholic priests, we never ask each other, how big is your church? Because that's not how you size each other up. So maybe there is something there about Protestantism. So maybe care to comment on a couple of those things, maybe
I really
historically.
appreciate this question, because I find when I get to talk about my book, like either people are interested in the political side or they're interested in the Pentecostals, like tongues and trance, and so it's fun to bring them together. Because I think they are one story. And one of my first sort of hunches that pushed me into this project was noticing the coincidence in time of Max Weber redefining charisma in this way that it becomes so influential, and the Azusa Street Revival. So this is the same decade. This is the big revival in Los Angeles that is now understood to be kind of the starting and launching point of modern Pentecostalism, and a particular way of interacting with the supernatural, with the Holy Spirit, that puts a lot of emphasis on this second thing that's supposed to happen to you beyond just converting to belief that Jesus is your Savior, and that is baptism in the Holy Spirit, which manifests in physical experience. And for many Pentecostals, it specifically comes to they expect that it will manifest in the gift of tongues. You will find yourself in this way that seems really not in your control, producing these speech sounds that, as most Pentecostals come to understand them, they don't sound to the untrained or unblessed ear like human language. It may be sometimes sometimes another person in the room is given the gift of interpretation and can translate it into the known language. But this becomes this really important marker of what it is to have what Pentecostals call the full gospel. And from that 1906 Azusa Street revival, sort of bouncing to other cities in the U.S., but quite quickly going international. I mean, within a decade, Pentecostal missionaries are making converts on every inhabited continent. And you could argue that it's a revival that has never stopped. So my question was, so this is interesting. Like, is it just a coincidence that this German sociologist is finding this new meaning in charisma to describe something that doesn't want to fit in the boxes offered by modern secular academia, at the very same time that these Pentecostals are expressing a certain frustration with the boxes and expectations of the institutional church? And obviously, I came to the conclusion that it is not a coincidence, that in fact, they are two quite different but related expressions of a frustration with secular modernity and rationalism. If you read one of the main leaders of the Azusa Street Revival, William Seymour, who was African-American, came out of a Catholic background in Louisiana. He lost an eye in smallpox and had trained as a minister and really became one of the leaders of this revival. He talks about the frustrations of the Christians who are coming to experience this revival. There are frustrations with simply going to church and sitting in a pew and paying attention to how fancy the clothes are on the person sitting next to you and what the marks are of worldly success. He says what people want, what they're hungry for, is power. And he means not power in an army or power in a big bank account, but Holy Spirit power. And it is this totally outrageous thing in 1906 because, in a context, even in Los Angeles, which is a sort of a more like boundary-pushing urban environment than you would find in other places in the U.S., still, we're talking about, Jim Crow America. We're talking about a country in which there are strict rules about what men and women can do and what they can do together. And in the early days of this revival, all of those boundaries are fragmenting. And, you have Chinese immigrants worshiping alongside, Black Americans worshiping alongside like Swedish pilgrims who have heard about this and have come to see what's going on. You have women standing up and prophesying, right? And to some extent, the Pentecostals, they don't maintain this deeply countercultural radicalism for too long, but it surfaces every now and again. And one thing I'm trying to suggest in this book is that there's a way in which, especially as our society has become more and more inclined to worship scientists as priests, and think of ourselves as rational, and not beholden to the ideas that entranced quote unquote pre-modern people. There's a way in which we are tempted to put political charisma over here and say it's totally different. There's a wall, and then over here is the weird stuff, like the trances and the healing and the tongues and all that. I think it's a continuum that expresses the same consistent human hunger for connection with the transcendent. I really saw this when I was learning about the 1930s. And I was sort of researching along two prongs simultaneously. I was researching the career of the great female Pentecostal preacher Amy Semple McPherson, who had this very successful healing ministry. She founded one of the first true megachurches in Los Angeles, a huge radio ministry. And she is reeling in the followers with a very urgent story about the end times coming soon and the power of the Holy Spirit people can expect in the meantime. And on the other hand, I was following the career of the Louisiana populist Huey Long, who became one of Franklin Roosevelt's major critics and political foes from the left, saying that the New Deal didn't go far enough. And on the one hand, these are two totally different characters, but there was actually a surprising amount of, there was an echo between the two kind of stories of the arc of justice and what the end times will look like. There was sort of this more worldly version offered by this Louisiana senator, and then there is this version offered by the Pentecostal evangelist. And I think, especially in our own kind of culture war context, where whatever sort of side you're on, however you perceive your location in the culture war, right? I think it's easy to see whoever's on the other side as a total space alien. I'm interested in sort of breaking that down and looking at the ways in which there's a sort of pre-political set of desires and hungers that we share in common.
Right.
Yeah. You're mentioning Long reminds me of a very interesting part of the book, which was that FDR, in a sense, you present him as sort of an anti-charismatic figure, a calming figure at first, but then someone who, as he begins to feel the challenge of Long, starts to adopt some of the arts of charisma and his rhetoric and so forth and become somewhat more extreme in his populism and so forth, which raises the question, I think, as to whether, as Weber and kind of the sociology of charisma takes hold, do political figures become more self-conscious about developing charisma or attempting to fill this hole in voters' lives? And that brings us to the $50,000 question, which is, the book promises to explain something about our current moment, and President Trump was referenced in the title. So maybe think about FDR and political figures since Weber, as charisma has become more of a category. How do we understand political figures in relationship to charisma as a kind of skill?
FDR is an example of that pattern I first noted in connection with George Washington, which is the most successful figures do not hew closely to the dominant charismatic type of the age, but rather they have an agility. They show an ability to cheat in that direction when it's necessary. So, FDR, early FDR, like the early fireside chats on the radio where he's pitching the kind of early New Deal to the American people. He has this calm voice of reason asking the American people to put aside their emotional panic and trust his brain trust, trust the experts to get the country back on track. But as he begins to encounter this threat from the left in 1934 or so, he unleashes his inner demagogue. And there are these great accounts left by his own advisors and speechwriters as they're watching him, on stage at Madison Square Garden, and they're scratching their heads like, who is this man? I mean, he sounds like this populist firebrand, going after Wall Street, and they're sort of horrified. But he reads the room rightly, and he senses that he can kind of deflate a bit of Huey Long's effectiveness by cheating in that direction without totally going over and making that his whole persona. So I think to kind of connect this to our current moment, there are some patterns that keep showing up in American history. So there is this appetite that is stronger in some areas than others for leaders who come to you and say, let's burn it all down, let's start anew. The institutions and the elites have not served you well. That's not a new theme in American history. But it seems to me that in earlier eras of our history, institutions have been stronger. The average American derived more of his or her sense of identity, duty, sort of life conception from relationships to institutions, a sense of being, in a tradition, whether it's religious or ethnic or something else. And I think in our own time, we are more fragmented and atomized than we have ever been. And the poll data on American trust in institutions is really startling, right? So 1958 was the first year when the National Election Study asked Americans, do you trust the federal government to do the right thing all or most of the time? In 1958, 75% of Americans said yes. In our own time, that figure is 22%. For self-identified Republicans, it's a bit lower. For Democrats, it's a little bit higher, so average 22%. But then you can go down the line of all the major institutions, right? Mainstream media, Congress, the Supreme Court, even the military, certainly higher ed. And we've seen a real cratering of trust in institutions. At the very same time as all of our lives have been overtaken by the glowing rectangle that we all carry around in our pockets, right? Which I think gives you the illusion of autonomy and self-sufficiency. You can answer any question you have, right, by scrolling and clicking. But in fact, the algorithms silo you in probably the most isolated way you have ever been, right? Feeding you what the algorithms think you want to know, but actually walling you off from the grand narratives that in prior eras Americans plugged themselves into and sort of had reference to. I think in prior eras, Americans, when a leader presented a story, we had more ways to sort of test the story, to see if it was credible. Because when I say storytelling, I don't mean that always means the story is made up. I think that's an easy mistake to make. The difference between a charismatic leader who can activate you into a new sense of what your role is, and maybe move the society further along the arc toward justice, and then the leader who leads in the opposite direction. I think it depends entirely on whether the story he or she is offering is based in reality or if it is sort of confected mythology. And I think in the past we had more ways of testing that. So we are, I think, in our current cultural moment, more susceptible to leaders who come along and have a compelling story. And we have less incentive to test the story and less ability to do so.
Fabulous. I think we have more questions, but I'm going to throw it open to the audience and see if there's any questions from the audience. Yeah, we'll start here.
Yeah, so I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on how much this connection between charisma has to do with economic dispossession. Some of the people that you mentioned, even Donald Trump, I think there's a lot of political commentators that link his rise to the 2008 financial crisis. You talked about Huey Long. How much of these figures are they able to capture kind of the popular spirit of the time based off of economic troubles?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are some cases in which the economic lens is really crucial. And certainly a major part of the story of the coalescing of Trump's coalition is the story of those who have been left out of the grand narrative of globalization and all of the riches it's supposed to bring. But I do think that there's a temptation to overestimate the degree to which charismatic leaders appeal especially to the dispossessed, right, to use a sort of old-fashioned word. So there was a kind of earlier generation of historical scholarship on Pentecostalism that cast the rise of this religious movement as a story of poor people who have nothing else working for them, and so they go for this extreme story of the supernatural. But a later generation of scholars went in and did a little more sort of fine-grained examination of the records that give us some sense of who were these first Pentecostals. And we find, in fact, that it's a much more mixed socioeconomic story. Or I think about, one of the characters I became interested in the late colonial revolutionary period is this prophetic figure named Jemima Wilkinson, who started life as a young Quaker girl, she's struck very ill, we think with typhus. Everyone thinks she's going to die. She comes out of it and says that indeed Jemima Wilkinson died, but her body has been now inhabited by the Holy Spirit. It's not totally clear. Her claims are a little confusing. Is she claiming to be a sort of Messiah or the Holy Spirit? It's a little bit confusing. She now transcends gender and dresses in a very androgynous fashion and goes by the title, the Public Universal Friend. Public friend is what Quakers called traveling evangelists. So if you look at the kinds of people who were compelled by the public universal friend's message and inclined to kind of shut down their lives and follow this utopian plan to build a sort of new Jerusalem in upstate New York, you do find some people, many women, who are dislocated in the context of the revolution, who do seem to have a sort of economic crisis on their hands. But you find other characters who don't fit that at all. I mean, one of her most prominent followers is this Rhode Island colonial judge, who's a very respectable figure. He builds an addition to his house to make a living space for his profit, and is willing to, cast aside the respect and trust and credibility that he has among his, his many fellow citizens, because he's compelled by this story. And the lesson I take from that is that humans can feel let down by the universe for all kinds of reasons, many of which are not material. I will say in our own time, if you look at kind of who is religious by the metrics that statisticians keep track of, rates of church attendance and so forth, they track with educational attainment. And in fact, the lowest levels of religiosity are among those at the absolute lowest socioeconomic level. The political scientist Ryan Burge has put this pithily by saying religion in our own time is becoming a luxury good. I think there's a degree to which it's evangelists and priests and clergy of various kinds have always struggled to reach the poorest of the poor. And that it makes a certain amount of sense. I mean, when you think about, if your life is absolutely a sort of a desperate attempt to figure out where your next meal is going to come from, you may have a sort of scattering, set of ideas and hopes and fears about the supernatural, but do you have any bandwidth to plug into a religious institution in a way that would get captured by the various ways we keep track of these things? Probably not. But I think that humans are so interesting because we are constantly doing things that are not in our material interest. And I think the great sort of story of the 20th and 21st century, when there was this prediction by the new atheist writers, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, those guys, that, religion is dying and we're going to become rational. That's sort of obviously not true. We are rational in the breach. So the religious impulses, they travel in various places, but I don't think they've gone away. And I think economics has to be part of the lens, but it can never be the only one.
That's great. Thank you. Yes, thanks. Fascinating talk. I was going to ask about the connection between crises and charisma. So you were talking about Franklin Roosevelt. After the Second World War, you get Harry Truman, a figure with very little charisma coming in. Similar thing after the First World War with Harding, Coolidge, and we see the same thing in Britain as well. I mean, after the Second World War with Attlee replacing Churchill, who Churchill famously says was a modest man with much to be modest about, sort of the anti-charisma. Is the fact that we're living in sort of an era of perma-crisis, does that lead to a susceptibility to charisma, a looking for charisma? And how do these two things sort of interact, crises and charisma, with regard to our search for it?
I appreciate you rattling off that list of relatively uncharismatic leaders, because it reminds us that you do not need to be charismatic to be an effective leader. In fact, you could argue it's a risk, and it can be a liability. Charisma is often, historically, I think it's been the avenue, the choice of the weak. If you think about it, if you have access to other levers of power, if you have, an anointed place in an institution, if you have a big military, at your command, you don't need to be charismatic. You don't need to subject yourself to this ephemeral, fragile relationship with your followers that could go up in smoke. And one of the great challenges of charismatic movements is what happens to the authority after the charismatic leader dies or sort of falls away from the scene in some way. I found myself in this project struggling with the question of what should be my metric of success, what makes a leader successful. And if the definition is the ability to really solve a communal or state problem, to instantiate policy ideas into reality, then that success shows up most frequently in leaders who, if they have charisma, they also have many other levers of power. They manage to leverage their charisma into a position of institutional prominence. They have at their command all the sort of mechanisms of government, right? In cases where it's more sort of a pure story of charisma, the question of success is a little more elusive. But I learned a lot thinking through the case of the Pan-Africanist leader Marcus Garvey, who founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1916, and he came to New York from time in Jamaica and the United Kingdom, and for a few years, late teens, early 20s, he was leading the largest black mass movement the world had ever seen, with this story of a kind of reclaiming of the divine destiny of people of African heritage, really a quite separationist, segregationist vision that said, this so-called American dream of, racial and ethnic harmony is a lie. And in fact, people of African descent need to band together, need to return to the African continent and build the civilization that we have the capacity to build because God has chosen us to do this. And there's this brief window when you would go to Harlem at the heyday of the UNIA, and you would see these incredibly impressive parades, rallies of thousands and thousands of people in uniforms. Garvey himself, arrayed in kind of military regalia with purple and green and gold silks and plumes coming out of his helmet, and chapters of the UNIA, local chapters blossoming not only throughout the country but abroad as well. But it seems to come to an end almost as quickly as it begins. He's on the radar of the FBI pretty quickly. He's a subversive presence. They charge him with mail fraud and put him in prison. He's deported, dies in not great financial state in London in 1940. And it might have seemed that at that point we can definitely say this movement is a failure. But I think if we widen the historical lens, our judgment changes. And we consider his sort of the after effects of his movement in the next generation. Two followers, two Garveyites, got married, settled in Nebraska, and had a son named Malcolm Little, who became Malcolm X and becomes, of course, this incredibly important figure for the next generation of black nationalism and that its political instantiation in the context of the civil rights movement. So there's a way in which these charismatic leaders who respond to a crisis and seem to fail can have a legacy that I think we can start to call influential enough that it counts as some kind of success. And to your question about crises, I will say, I think the longer you study history, the more you realize that at any point, at any year, in any culture, you can find thoughtful people pacing around, looking panicked, thinking this is the end of civilization. It's all over. It's very hard to pinpoint an era in which there's not someone's not feeling a sense of crisis. So it may be that we need to sort of parse that on the level of subculture. And the Great Depression, we date it too casually with the 1929 collapse of the stock market. If we consider, well, when did earlier subcultures begin to really feel the effects of the drought that turned the whole middle part of the country into the Dust Bowl? Or we think about the context of the Great Migration and the economic suffering that African Americans are experiencing well before in the time of Marcus Garvey, well before that becomes the national story in the Great Depression, we can maybe begin to suss out why maybe charismatic figures have resonance early on in some subcultures more than others. But I think charismatic figures they're a sort of ubiquitous, omnipresent part of our landscape, in part because it is the human condition to feel ourselves to be in crisis.
Another question?
Thanks very much. Thanks. I was curious, early on in the conversation, you made the observation that charismatic leaders seem to be polarizing perhaps more than charming. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why that is. If charismatic leadership draws on the human desire to be connected with the transcendent, and I think I'm convinced by that argument, how then do we explain that each of these leaders seems to have as many people who are viscerally repulsed by this narrative as they do those who want to participate in it? How do we explain these divergent reactions?
Yeah, well, I think a good story does not cast everyone as a hero. A good story casts some people as villains, and it leaves some people out entirely. So that gave me at least a rough guide to how people are reacting and why. I mean, it's one of the things that differentiates a story from a theme or a set of slogans. A story has characters. A story has an arc. It invites you into a role in a particular plot. It promises a kind of resolution. It promises tension and the overcoming of that tension. But it needs people whose role is not exactly desirable. So I think that has everything to do with it. I remember one clarifying moment for me was thinking about some of the cliches that come up, when I would tell people I was working on a book about charisma. They would say, oh, like surely you're writing about Bill Clinton, right? I mean, famously, if he caught eyes with you, he would make you feel like you're the only one in the room, and right, that's the cliche about him. But as I thought about it, I thought about how you're only in that room with Bill Clinton or whoever the politician is, probably because you've already bought in to some degree into the story that he is pitching. There is this thing that happens upstream of your encounter with the leader, if you have one, that is, I think, your encounter with the story. And so this is where I think media becomes so important, and why the story of charismatic leaders is intertwined with whatever media technology is most effective at getting that story out. So I saw this really play out in the early expansion of the Mormon Church. Joseph Smith is someone who is commonly remembered as physically, interpersonally very compelling. Pretty tall for the time, about 6 feet, bright blue eyes. You can find new Mormon converts talking about shaking his hand and feeling the Holy Spirit thrill them from the top of their head to the soles of their feet. But then you can also find written accounts left to us by skeptics who say, listen, the minute I laid eyes on this guy, I knew he was a charlatan. He had these like weirdly fat hands. I actually ran across that in one of the sources. I didn't want to shake his hand. So what's happening, right? Like, okay, I can't really use his physical presence to help me understand the growth of this movement. But then if you think about some of the striking data points in the early growth of the Mormon Church, thousands of British people who convert to the Mormon message in the early years of this church and shut down their lives in Britain, move thousands of miles across the Atlantic to this tiny nothing town, Nauvoo, Illinois, on the banks of the Mississippi, to live with their prophet. But they've never even met him. What did they encounter? They encountered Mormon missionaries, and probably those missionaries gave them the Book of Mormon. So they encountered the message. And I'm not saying that the leader is not part of this, because Joseph Smith sort of masterfully cast himself in the story in a leading role. But it's the story that has the power. And I think that's the framework that helps us figure out why do some people loathe this person and other people are compelled.
Hey, quick question. So I actually grew up extremely strict apostolic Pentecostal. I left the church about a little over a year ago. Kind of a question of I've seen the benefit and the empowerment, but I've also seen the control and the submission with women involved in the church. Women can prophesy, women can speak in tongues, they can be ministers in the church, but there's also a level of submission that is required. How do you see that affecting women, believers specifically, in civic life, in the political world? Do you see any kind of influence in that throughout the last 100 years? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. So there's a sort of Pentecostal piece to it, but I also hear you asking a kind of broader question about women and charisma. I think that impulse that we were talking about a few minutes ago, that sort of Reformation impulse that in America has metastasized into this emphasis on the individual, that it takes many forms, but one form in the context of Pentecostal churches is really a huge amount of supernatural freedom, when you think about it, for the individual to claim this kind of relationship with the divine. That has a dark side of, I think, a real temptation to slide into certain kinds of authoritarianism. Because in many Protestant and certainly more charismatic Pentecostal contexts, it has become fairly untethered from what we might call institutional checks and balances. So this is not to say that there aren't plenty of sins to talk about in highly hierarchical expressions of Christianity, like the Catholic Church and so forth. But the problems are different, I think. And there's a way in which American charismatic evangelical culture sort of encourages, it creates the opportunity, because humans are depraved. I mean, we are terrible. It creates the opportunity to turn claims of supernatural power onto other members of the community in a way that I think can go kind of unchecked because of that anti-institutional dimension. On women in general, I was kind of, as I was getting to the end of my project, I noticed that I was writing actually, you might think, right, given like the story of first, second, third wave feminism, you might think that the further along I got in history, the more women I would be writing about. Because surely like women just don't, they don't have access to as much power earlier on. Surely they're not showing up as much in the narrative. I found kind of the opposite to be true. I found that early on, there are more women, I think because in early American history, they are boxed out of various forms of institutional and political power. There are more women doing an end run around the hierarchy and claiming divine revelation to assert power that way. And actually, especially with second wave feminism and beyond, as women gain greater and greater access to institutional levers of power, not that disparities don't persist, but in fact, given the choice, women tend to make the right decision, which is to opt for the more reliable forms of influence. You do see persistent reliance on authority I would call more charismatic among women in Christian subcultures where they are still boxed out of those institutional leadership roles. So the whole world of evangelical women Bible teachers, or pastors' wives who don't have institutional status in and of themselves, they're not ordained in and of themselves, but they have built kind of an amazing internet ministry and a sort of social media brand, and they have huge conferences. Now, I have encountered, kind of feminist critiques of that who say that they are forced into this weak position and this ephemeral power that can go away if their followers, decide they don't like them tomorrow, and this is unfair. But it seems to me that actually conservative evangelical women have more power and status and are more visible, and you could argue are shaping the cultural and theological experience of lay believers to a greater degree than women are in the mainline liberal Protestant denominations, where they are allowed to be priests and they're allowed to run all of the administrative boards, but they play a sort of back behind the scenes role as those institutions are shrinking and have simply less power. So, the relationship between charisma and sort of female empowerment, I think, is a complicated one.
Thank you. Thank you for this great conversation. It's really captivating, and I'm sorry if my question is a little bit boring and conventional in this context. But the more I hear you talk about the story that you tell in the book, the more I'm thinking about your view and maybe assumptions about human nature. So what I mean there is there seems to be a certain foundational moral philosophy, in a sense, that underpins your story, whereby there are certain standard components of human nature. Charisma pops up here and there in some people, maybe not in others. But then the question that arises from that, so whenever you talk about the human hunger for connection with the transcendent, or our sort of common responses to moments of suffering and so on and so forth. The question that rises, though, is what does this do for your historical method here? So is the story that you're telling one of charisma universally understood and one that could be told anywhere on earth? Or is it a story that is specific to the American context? And if so, what role specifically does charisma play in American history and politics? How would you summarize that? Yeah. Do you see what I'm asking? Sure. So, because I've been working on the question while hearing so many other interesting things that you've been saying, and many other questions pop up. But thank you.
Yeah. Historians are, put a huge amount of emphasis on the peculiarities of context, and I'm typical of my guild in that way. So there, I think, is a very broad pre-political observation that I do think holds true of human nature, and that I think can be used to raise interesting questions across any cultural context. And that I would put my money, in this sense, on the abiding hunger for a relationship between my disorganized life in its puny shape and status and some big, grand, transcendent narrative. I do think that is something that we might find in any context. However, that is simply a launching point for specific questions that have to be posed not just to a particular national context or culture, but each era. And so I'm saying that even in different eras of American history, the way that manifests is different. I do think we got into some of the dimensions of what is exceptionally American and why charismatic leaders have played, I think, an exceptionally prominent role in this context. And it's because of reasons of historical contingency that have to do with the relationship of American culture to that European backstory. I think, thinking about my method in comparison to other scholars who are trying to make sense of some of the same things, my instinct has always been, since I was a student, to take people's ideas and beliefs seriously and sincerely and not assume that they are a pious varnish on a substrate of fundamentally material interests. So this is not to say that I encourage, historically minded students to be naive and to always take subjects at their word and never ask questions. And I do think that we as humans, we are in this sort of constant dialectic between the ideas that we are presented with as frames for making sense of reality and our concrete situations. And we all have a bundle of often quite incoherent motives that are interacting with our relationship with those ideas. So it's not simply that ideas download to our brains and frame how we move through the world. Max Weber had an interesting way of putting this. He called ideas the switchmen of history. So maybe a steam train is chugging along because of broad, economic, sociological factors. But whether that train goes this way or that way depends a lot on the ideological frame. And I'm not sure if I entirely agree, but I think it's a really useful metaphor. So I guess those are two pieces of my starting point that are methodological assumptions. And any scholar comes to their project with assumptions of some kind. I think some of us do a better job of articulating our theory of human nature than others, but it's always there, and it should always be a question you ask of anything you're reading.
I think we have time for one more question. Did you?
I'm not sure if it's worthy of the last question of the event, but thank you so much for a fantastic talk. I was just wondering if I could ask you to reflect on the role of creativity and the imagination in the forming of charisma. Because when I think about connections with the transcendent, I could also consider kind of making visible or unconscious elements visible, forging new narratives that destroy old ones and make unexpected kind of connections between things previously thought unrelated, right? So all of these things to me seem like the kinds of things that creative people do, and artists and musicians. So I was wondering if I could just ask you about their role, and then maybe reflect on whether or not this sort of kind of a capital R romantic idea, at least in the kind of secular manifestations, right, that possibly then goes along with celebrity culture. But essentially, it's just about the role of imagination and creativity.
Thank you for this question. I think creativity is so important because there's a way in which successful charismatic leaders have to be, in the story they're pitching, they have to be just weird enough, but not so weird that they make no sense to the cultural frames of the people that they are trying to appeal to. So I think about Joseph Smith's use of King James language and biblical imagery and reference points that make sense in the frame, that have a certain authority for his listeners who are kind of broadly familiar with the Protestant tradition. But he goes off on this path of incredibly imaginative, heterodox storytelling about the new world and about kind of layers of heaven that have a sort of space age quality. Imagine the cosmos as really a set of frontiers that we can continue to conquer as we move beyond death. This came home to me, though, this particular creative genius that human charismatic leaders have. When I went down a bit of a rabbit hole and tried to learn more about generative AI and ask experts in the industry, can AI have charisma? And I was interviewing engineers who work at these startups that are in the business of developing avatars and this kind of thing, and getting closer and closer to creating avatars that mimic so many of the details you love in a compelling speaker. And so their first response when I would pose that question would be, of course. I mean, maybe not now, but in 6 months, definitely, right? But as the conversation went on, it became more and more clear that they were talking about charm. So if you think about what is so appealing about the chatbots that some of us have relationships with, the person who is constantly texting with his replica and has lost interest in human relationships because the replica girlfriend is like so compelling. What the replica chatbot is good at is creating frictionless interaction, foregrounding your problems, making you feel special in the center of the universe. The replica is really good at charm. The replica is not good, and I don't think will be any good, at charisma. I think there are certain features of the charismatic storytelling I'm describing that can be learned, in that you can be a student of your culture, and you can gain information that helps you understand what are the hungers and frustrations of people? Who is being left out of the stories that are told by mainstream institutions and elites? So there's a certain craft to it. But there is this like instinctive ability to riff on and respond to in a fundamentally weird way that is romantic with a capital R, that does elude kind of rational, will not be reduced to a science, despite the efforts of many business school leadership studies programs to do so. And I find some comfort, I'm hanging on to this idea that here is one thing that AI will not be able to do. And that's not to say that the charismatic leader can't send out AI bots to, do his bidding, but I think we have a monopoly on charisma.
I think Professor Lim will agree with me that the audience questions were better than our questions, so thank you all. The book is Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. It's full of fascinating stuff. It's beautifully written. I urge you to read it. But for now, let's a round of applause for our speaker.